I'm Michael Martinez, and you're about to listen to an AI-generated discussion of two of my articles about the Variags of Khand. The older article was published on a website called Tolkien Studies on the Web. The more recent article was published on the Middle-earth blog. Both sites can be found on zenite.org. I'm not sure of what the correct pronunciation of either Variags or Khand should be, but the AI hosts used two pronunciations for each that seem okay to me. They also mentioned the Uzi rule, which holds that all the orcs in The Lord of the Rings must have carried Uzi submachine guns because J.R.R. Tolkien never said they didn't. The rule illustrates the absurdity of some fan arguments that are based on a principle of false logic called absence of denial. This discussion is experimental in that it marks the first time I've given two distinct sources of information to the AI tool. I feel the system did an excellent job of summarizing and blending unique points from either article. The AI hosts don't attribute any talking points to either article directly, although that may be because there is considerable overlap between the sources. The older article provides more details. You will find links to both the articles in this podcast description.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're heading into a really shadowy bit of Middle-earth history. We're going south and east of Mordor, trying to figure out who are the Variags of Khand.
Ah, the Variags. Yeah, they're one of those names that just jumps out, doesn't it? You see them in The Lord of the Rings just enough to make you curious, but, well, there's not much there.
Exactly. They show up for this massive battle and then, poof, almost nothing. So that's our goal for this deep dive. Take what little Tolkien did give us and, see what we can piece together. And we're relying on some specific research for this.
That's right. We're looking closely today at Michael Martinez's work. He wrote a couple of articles, both called Who Are the Variags of Khand? One's on his blog, the Middle-earth and J.R.R. Tolkien blog, and the other appeared in Tolkien Studies on the Web. He really digs into the clues.
Okay, so let's start right there. What do the actual books, Tolkien's published stuff, tell us? What are the cold, hard facts?
Well, first off, location, Khand. It's shown on the maps, southeast of Mordor. Pretty clearly marked as under Sauron's influence, a subject state, or maybe an ally he controls.
And the Variags are the people from there.
Or at least a key group from there.
Yeah.
And they fight for Sauron. That's definitely.
And they fight on the biggest stage possible, really.
Absolutely. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields, that's their main appearance. They're listed right there with the armies pouring out of Osgiliath, led by the Witch King.
Yeah, there's that incredible description, isn't there? It lists the forces. Easterlings with axes, then Variags of Khand, Southrons in scarlet, and those terrifying black men like half-trolls. Really vivid stuff.
It is. Though it's worth a small clarification, something the research points out. The text technically says the Easterlings had the axes, not necessarily the Variags. It's a tiny detail, I know, but...
But important when you have so little else to go on. Precision matters.
Exactly.
And this wasn't their only fight against Gondor, was it? There was history there.
There was. Appendix A mentions they tangled with Gondor before the War of the Ring. At least one other major time.
That involved the Wainwriters, didn't it? I seem to remember that connection.
Yes, spot on.
Yeah.
Appendix A talks about this big attack where the Wainwriters coming from the north actually coordinated with forces from Khand and near Harad. It was a big north-south pincer movement against Gondor.
And doesn't Unfinished Tales add a little more detail about that? About the allies?
It does. It mentions the Wainwriters joining up with, and this is the key phrase, new allies in Khand. And it adds that when this eastern army attacked Gondor, their vanguard had this huge cavalry force, much bigger than expected, alongside their chariots.
Which strongly suggests the folks from Khand, maybe the Variags, were known for their cavalry. Horsemen.
It certainly points that way. Formidable horsemen. So, okay, we know roughly where they're from, who they fought for, when they fought, but that's kind of it from the main story.
And the really striking thing, the core of the mystery, is that Tolkien himself just didn't leave notes explaining them. No essays, no background sketches, nothing definitive.
That's exactly it. A name on a map, a mention in battle, and then blank. Christopher Tolkien even notes this in The Peoples of Middle-earth. He says Variag and Khand were added pretty late in the writing process, around the same time as some other names and details.
Late additions often mean less background got filled in, I suppose.
Often, yes. And Christopher Tolkien also mentioned these. These names came from Middle-earth's Eastern languages. So, not Elvish, not Western, something else entirely.
Which, naturally, with such a big gap, leads to a lot of speculation, right? Fans, scholars trying to fill in the blanks.
Oh, absolutely. And when you have so little text, people inevitably turn to other things, like etymology, digging into the names themselves, which is what Martinez does.
Yeah.
He also rightly points out that, stuff made up for games or movies, that's usually ignored by people focused purely on Tolkien's writing.
Right. So one theory that sometimes pops up online, the idea that the Variags were mercenaries, paid soldiers for Sauron.
Yeah, Martinez tackles that one head on. And he argues, pretty convincingly, I think, that it just doesn't fit. Look, anywhere else in Tolkien's work, Sauron doesn't hire armies. His forces are subjects he rules, peoples he dominates, or allies he's corrupted or coerced with his power.
And the way they fight, often to the death, it feels like more than just a paycheck involved. It suggests, I don't know, total control or fear.
Exactly. Or that kind of terrible fealty he inspired. The research calls the mercenary theory an example of the Uzi rule. It's a bit of a funny name for a logical fallacy.
The Uzi rule.
Yeah, it's basically arguing something is true just because there's no specific text saying it isn't true, even if all the existing evidence points the other way. There's zero evidence Sauron paid troops, and plenty suggesting he commanded through fear and power. It just doesn't line up.
Okay, so mercenary idea, probably not. Let's get back to the names then. Variag. What can the word itself tell us?
Now, this is where it gets fascinating. Martinez points out that Variag is the Slavic version of Varangur, or the Old Norse Varangi. And historically, the Varangians, well, they were Norse warriors, Vikings often, who served as elite guards for rulers elsewhere. Most famously, the Byzantine emperors.
The Varangian Guard in Constantinople.
Right.
So a direct historical link.
A very direct one. And linguists like David Sallow, who Martinez references, have noted that Variag itself is actually a rare English word. It comes from the Russian Variag, meaning Varangian. You can find it in older dictionaries, apparently.
Whoa, hang on, that's interesting. Christopher Tolkien says it's from an Eastern language of Middle-earth. But the word Tolkien shows is from a real-world Eastern European language, links to Norsemen.
Precisely. It adds this whole other layer. It suggests Tolkien might have been deliberately playing with real-world history and language.
Okay, intriguing. What about Khand? Any clues there?
Khand is murkier. Again, Christopher Tolkien says Eastern language, but Tolkien gave no definition. Martinez, however, notes it looks a bit like the Proto-Indo-European root Khand, meaning to shine.
To shine. How does that fit a place near Mordor? Seems bright.
Yeah, it feels a bit abstract, doesn't it? That root gives us words like candle, incandescent, even incense. But Martinez also points out real place names in Asia, like Kandahar, and tribal names like Khand or Khand in India and Pakistan. So the suggestion is maybe Tolkien had something specific in mind, perhaps related to the landscape, an arid place, a desert that maybe shines under the sun but can still support people.
It fits that pattern of Tolkien sometimes having deeper roots for his names, even if he didn't spell them out. Like Mumakil, right? Martinez mentions that's another Eastern name, and Tolkien had earlier Elvish ideas for long-snouted creatures before landing on that.
Exactly. It shows a process. The names weren't just sounds. They likely carried some meaning for him, even if lost to us.
And this leads to a really key point in the research. Maybe Variag isn't what these people called themselves at all.
That's a huge possibility. It could be an exonym, a name given to them by others. Or maybe it's the designation Tolkien used, translating some other concept, like how he uses ranger for the Dúnedain of the North.
And if Variag is a designation, not their native name, what does that imply?
It could imply they weren't the original inhabitants of Khand. Maybe they were outsiders who settled there.
Okay, this is where Michael Martinez starts connecting the dots, right? Taking these linguistic hints and weaving them with actual Middle-earth history.
Yes, exactly. He lays out two possibilities he considers very realistic and plausible based on trying to make sense of all these fragments, the name, the location, the history.
Let's hear them. What's the first one?
Okay, possibility number one. The Variags were renegade Northmen.
Renegade Northmen. From where?
Remember Appendix A, back in the 13th century of the Third Age? King Minalcar of Gondor, who later took the name Romindazel II, had big dealings with the Northmen living near Rhovanion. But some of those Northmen weren't loyal. They sided with Gondor's enemies, the Easterlings, out of greed or old grudges.
Right, and Minalcar eventually defeated that alliance, didn't he? Around 1248 TA.
He did. A decisive victory. So Martinez suggests, what happened to those defeated, disloyal Northmen? Maybe they weren't wiped out. Maybe they weren't willing to submit to Gondor. Maybe they were pushed south and east.
Driven away, possibly ending up far away in Khand.
It's plausible. They could have migrated, perhaps around Mordor's borders, eventually settling in that southeastern land.
And how does that tie back to the name Variag?
This is where it clicks beautifully. Martinez brings up an old definition he found from an 1878 philology source of Varangian as meaning denizen. And the original sense of denizen was basically an alien admitted to residence and certain rights, a naturalized foreigner.
So outsiders who settled and became part of the place.
Exactly. It fits perfectly. A group of renegade Northmen, outsiders, settle in Khand, become naturalized over time, and become known as the Variags, the denizens, the settlers. It gives a whole internal Middle-earth story to the name.
Wow, okay, that's a compelling case. What's the second possibility Martinez puts forward?
Possibility number 2. The Variags were Black Númenoreans.
Okay, the followers of Sauron from Númenor who set up kingdoms in the south and east after the downfall.
Correct. And again, the name Variag could fit in that sense of outsiders settling among other peoples, maybe ruling them, much like the historical Varangians did among the Slavs.
And we know Black Númenorians survived into the Third Age.
We do. They were definitely present in the south and east, ruling over local populations. Martinez suggests the Variags could even be linked to the people the mouth of Sauron came from. He notes that Tolkien seems to have tweaked the mouth's backstory around the same time he introduced the Variags, which might hint at a connection.
And there were named Black Númenorian lords in the south, weren't there? Near Mordor.
Yes. Appendix A mentions Harumr and Funur, renegade Númenorians who gained power in Harad, just south of Mordor, after Númenor's fall. We don't know their ultimate fate, but they prove that these Dark Númenorians were active and influential rulers in those regions. So finding a group of their descendants settled in Khand, it's definitely within the realm of possibility.
Both theories seem to hinge on understanding how Tolkien used words, doesn't it? Borrowing terms, but maybe using them in a specific, perhaps older sense.
That's absolutely key, and something Martinez emphasizes. Tolkien often used what linguists call calques, borrowing or translating words or concepts, but applying them with a meaning that might be simpler or more foundational than their later historical baggage.
You mean like his use of the word shire?
That's the perfect example Martinez uses. Tolkien explained shire was his translation of the Hobbit word Susa Pith, meaning basically area of settlement, sphere of occupation. He deliberately chose that simpler, older word instead of something like fief, which he used for Gondor's divisions, because fief has all those later medieval feudal connotations. He wanted something more basic for the hobbits.
So applying that logic back to Variag,
It suggests Tolkien might not have just grabbed Variag because it sounded like some generic Eastern barbarian or mercenary group. He might have been tapping into that historical concept, outsiders settling among a native population, perhaps integrating and applying that idea to a specific people in his own world.
and that old denizen definition, aliens becoming naturalized citizens, fits that concept of settlers perfectly, whether they were Northmen or Númenorians.
It lines up really well with both possibilities, yeah. It reinforces the idea that they likely weren't the original inhabitants of Khand, but came from elsewhere.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. The Variags of Khand. Incredibly mysterious figures in the end.
Definitely. We know they're from Khand, southeast of Mordor. We know they were important enough allies for Sauron to use them at the Pelennor Fields, and they had fought Gondor before alongside the Wainriders.
But that's about where the hard facts run out. Tolkien just didn't tell us more.
Which forces us into detective work, really. Looking at the analysis by people like Michael Martinez, digging into the names, the context, the faint echoes in Middle-earth history. The mercenary idea seems, well, pretty unlikely given how Sauron worked.
But the names Variag and Khand, they offer these tantalizing hints. Variag possibly meaning pledged fighters, or maybe more significantly, denizens, settlers. And Khand, perhaps hinting at the land itself, maybe arid, sun-scorched.
Which leads to those two main plausible theories Martinez puts forward, based on connecting those hints with Middle-earth's past. They were probably men, yes, but maybe not native to Khand. Theory 1. Descendants of those renegade Northmen driven south centuries before.
Theory 2. A group of Black Númenorians, remnants of Sauron's old servants from the Second Age, who established themselves in Khand, perhaps linking to figures like the Mouth of Sauron or lords like Harumr and Funur.
And we have to stress, these are still, educated guesses. Tolkien didn't give us the final word. But their guess is built carefully on the clues we do have, and on how Tolkien seemed to build his world and use language.
It really is amazing how much depth you can potentially find hiding behind just a couple of names on a map and a line in a battle scene. So here's something for you, the listener, to think about. Considering Tolkien's methods, his use of history and language, and these plausible origins Michael Martinez explores, which idea feels more compelling to you? Renegade Northmen finding a new home, or exiled Black Númenoreans holding onto power? And what might either origin tell us about the bigger picture, the tangled relationships between peoples in the East and South, and the true complex nature of Sauron's influence beyond Mordor's borders? Definitely something to ponder until our next deep dive.